Hey folks, welcome back to the channel. I got a lot of notes today and I want to talk about something that's probably going to be a really important investment over the next couple of years, and those are metal stocks. So let's talk about metal stocks. I haven't talked a lot about metal stocks on my channel for a bunch of reasons, mostly because it's kind of boring, but I believe now is the time to do so. Look, metal's absolutely critical to the economy, so why don't I talk about it more? Like I just said, I think it's kind of boring, but also metals prices and demand fluctuate wildly. Prices are super volatile. Metal mining companies are unstable, at least the small ones are, and they go out of business all the time. And that's actually part of the business model. The mining majors are the ones that stay in business, and they constantly create these subsidiaries that go out and do explorations. And they're kind of designed to limit liability when they fail, right? So we rarely ever see one of those new mining companies emerge as a new mining major and, from that small cap realm. And this is where we'd all like to be an early investor. But my friends, times are a-changing, and a lot of it has to do with some unfortunate things that are happening in the world. At least since the collapse of the Soviet Union, the potential for international conflict has never been higher. Now, as much as I don't want this to happen, I believe that we're simply entering a new period of human conflict as old systems of resource allocation are failing, and really those old systems of resource allocation never worked for a large portion of the population of the world. You guys know who Yuval Harari is? I think that while a lot of what historian and philosopher Yuval Harari says is highly debatable, I do think that he's right when he says that old systems are failing due to the accelerating speed of technological change, particularly artificial intelligence, which is overwhelming the slower organic pace of human evolution. Things are just changing too fast for old systems to deal with. Now, if humanity weren't such jerks, we could probably sit down with each other and find reasonably equitable solutions to modern problems and new systems of resource allocation. But I think and I think that the likelihood of this happening is pretty small, and I'm going to prepare for that potential high conflict future as an investor, which means metals stocks. Because everything about future war is going to be a surprise, but what won't be a surprise is a demand for metals. The iconic phrase from the video game Fallout, war never changes, is just dead wrong. War is always changing. In fact, it changes so quickly that every military on the planet at the outset of a conflict is really prepared to fight the last war and not the one that they're currently engaged in. The industrial needs of the world are going through a period of rapid change. Countries around the world are rearming, military budgets are increasing, and proxy conflict is kicking into high gear. Now, in the past, there were two major weapon suppliers, Russia and the United States, but oddly, in the last 3 decades, they've had really highly intertwined supply chains, and the United States has been dependent to some degree on raw materials from Russia. Russia has been dependent on the US for finished components and electronics. All of that is already changing as the supply chain for the arms industry is starting to split. Russia is also losing its huge weapons market. The war in Ukraine has exposed both the quality issues of Russian weapons and the absolute inability of Russia to produce at scale some of their most advertised technological wonders like the S-400 and S-500 air defense systems and the Su-57 multi-role fighter and the T-14 Armata tank. Even Russia's drone production would shame their Soviet forefathers who were industrial masters. On paper, these Russian weapon systems look great, and the prototypes may have the capabilities that they claim, but none of that really matters. If you order a dozen S-500 defense systems or 100 Su-57s, Russia cannot deliver on them. They simply don't have the industrial capacity to do so anymore. Russia is not and will never be the Soviet Union in terms of its ability to produce war material. They're going to lose a huge portion of their export market for weapons. They are going to lose a huge part of their export market for weapons as a result of the Ukraine war. The United States has a commanding share of the global export market for weapons, capturing 42% of sales between 2019 and 2023. That's actually double the previous 4-year period. But the war in Ukraine has given new players the opportunity to showcase their products, and they are quickly taking Russia's place in the international weapons market. France, Germany, Turkey, South Korea, and most importantly, China. Now, a lot of people don't realize that France had already supplanted the Russians in the weapons export market prior to the war in Ukraine. France captured somewhere north of 11% of the market, and that share is growing as they move into markets once dominated by Russia. China's export share is growing as well, and they're beginning to explore new markets for their weapons after a decade of not really trying too hard to market them. But the recent success of the PL-15 missile in the Pakistan-India conflict has sparked some new interest in Chinese weapons exports. So can you invest in these foreign weapons makers? In the case of France and Germany, and in many other cases, yes. But in other places, these companies are not publicly traded or they are state-owned enterprises. But there is a way to backdoor an investment in the rearmament of the world, kind of like Levi Strauss created jeans instead of going out and mining gold. It's basically selling jeans to miners or selling pickaxes to miners instead of actually going out and mining gold. And that's how we get back to metals. There are people watching this video right now that are thinking that I'm going to talk about rare earth minerals or something like that, which I'm not. Maybe they think I'm going to talk about lithium deposits or manganese nodules, which I'm not, because these are not rare at all. Lithium is the 18th most abundant element on the planet, manganese is the 12th most abundant on the planet, and neither of them are actually rare earth minerals. No, I'm actually talking about something a lot simpler. Titanium, antimony, and tungsten. Titanium is used for aircraft parts, armor plating, Navy ships, and spacecraft. Titanium alloys have high versatility in different environments and high tolerances when they're alloyed correctly. The leading exporters are South Africa, Mozambique, and Australia. Antimony. Now, the countries that dominate the antimony supply are not high on America's list of friends. China, Russia, and Tajikistan accounted for nearly 80% of the antimony produced globally, and a lot of that just has to do with cost. Developing new sources is critical to national security for the United States and European nations, and I expect further investments into mining this semi-metal from known deposits in Alaska, Montana, and Nevada. Bullets, explosives, night vision lasers, bearings, semiconductors, electrical cable sheathing, printing machines, solders, and pewter are just some of the products made with alloys that contain some antimony. Tungsten is also critical for military applications due to its density and hardness. It's used in armor-piercing projectiles, armor itself, rocket engine nozzles, and radiation shielding. China and Vietnam are the leading producers of tungsten. All of these elements are critical for any nation's military-industrial complex, and so no nation wants to be dependent on a potentially hostile supplier for such a critical element. Now, these elements aren't rare. There are sources that could be developed all over the world, and we're likely to see that in the future. For the last 3 decades, the supply chain for these 3 militarily crucial elements has been fairly global and fairly integrated, and we still traded with our international rivals. And as capitalism does, it sourced the elements from the least expensive place without much of a regard to geopolitical considerations. So that is changing now. The world is dividing itself up into 2 camps in terms of military supply chain, which means that investment into more expensive but known sources of these metals is going to happen, both through government intervention into the mining industry, as well as some daring companies that are willing to take the gamble on supply chain disruption. Investing in these 3 metals, titanium, antimony, and tungsten, is actually a pretty agnostic way to invest in the rearming and reindustrialization of the world, as it doesn't really matter who has the best technology or who wins the government contract because they have the best product or political connections. Anyone who wins the contract is going to need access to these 3 metals. So I'm going to list some of the top Western aligned suppliers for each element in this video, but remember, there are no recommendations to buy, sell, or hold any security in a YouTube video. You have to do your own research. I'm also going to put these companies and their ticker symbols in the description so you can look there. So for titanium, we're looking at ATI, Chemours, Kronos Worldwide, and Tronox. For antimony, most of these companies are in Australia and trade on the Australian exchange or over the counter in the US. That's Antilles Gold, Labrador Resources, Perpetua Resources, and United States Antimony. For tungsten stocks, it's a little more difficult. Most companies are actually in China, but there are a few tungsten suppliers traded on US or Western stock exchanges. Once again, ATI, Belgian-based Umicore, which is traded in Brussels, and the Swedish company Sandvik, with the acquisition of Buffalo Tungsten, became one of the largest tungsten suppliers. So this is where you can start your research. Check the description for ticker symbols and where the stock trades. Thanks for watching and have a great day.